Christianity spread, even under persecution, without a compiled Bible. Something that had happened was so compelling that over and over and over and over again, Christ's followers were willing to suffer and even die rather than forsake the Jesus they had come to know and follow. So the Bible is indeed one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given to humanity. But in this kind of environment, it isn't the primary motivation for this sort of faith commitment.
Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
I want to welcome you back to Theology Curator. I'm your host, Kurt Willems, and we have been in a series called The Bible. Very creative title, I know, The Bible, but it is something that is central to how we think about Jesus. And actually, one of the things I've said is that the Bible isn't the center. So we're going to talk about some of those distinctions today. And before I do, I want to remind you that this is also part of a written sort of newsletter format as well. And those newsletters are ones that you can actually access online. Just head over to theologycurator.com/newsletter. That's theologycurator.com/newsletter. Of course, make sure you're spelling theology and curator correctly, but you'll get there. And if you can't figure it out, just Google the Bible part, whatever, and Kurt Willems, and you'll find me. So anyway, hey, I am thrilled to be in part 4 today with you. And kind of want to track backwards just for a second to make sure that we know where we've been. We started out by framing this series by saying, the Bible is important. It is central, but not the center, right? And that's one thing that's really important that we look at, that really Christianity, if we want to call the early days that, is a movement. It's not about a book. It's about a movement. It's about something that happened. We've called that thing that happened the Jesus event, just for short. And when I say the Jesus event, I mean his incarnation, his life, his teachings, his self-sacrificial death, and resurrection, ascension, and promised return, right? Now, the promised return is something that will happen, but everything else about what I would mean by the Jesus event is about something that happened. And the most central thing that happened in all of that is the resurrection. When we think about a social movement, if there's no resurrection, there's really no movement. And without a movement, we don't eventually get the book. And so that is where we started. And we really looked at why the Bible in the second episode. And we said, you know what? The reason the Bible comes to exist is that something compelling happened that warranted a written response so that they could pass this thing down. And we're going to talk even more in depth about that today. And in our previous one, in part 3, we talked about how Christianity is not a book club. It's not primarily designed or envisioned in such a way that, a bunch of people get together and they talk about a book. Now, here's the deal. The book helps us lean into the movement that Jesus started with the resurrection. The book is inspired, but we don't worship the book. The book isn't the center. At the very center is Jesus of Nazareth, the resurrected, incarnated God of the universe. And so that is the absolute epitome of everything Christianity is about. Now, of course, how do we get to know the Jesus? Well, the Jesus, that sounds kind of funny, right? How do we get to know Jesus? Well, we get to know Jesus through traditions about him. The primary tradition is this God-inspired collection of documents called the New Testament, along with the Hebrew scriptures, which we inherited as part of that story. And so we are all about book clubs. We just don't want to say that book club equals church. Book club is part of being a Christian. Book club is part of being a follower of Jesus in the context of Christian community. It's just not the center. The center is Jesus of Nazareth, and we interpret all of life through him. We learn about Jesus. So central to our teaching is, in fact, the Bible. And the point of it all is that we are part of this movement of generosity, love, and beauty as God is reclaiming every square inch of the cosmos. I mean, that's gotta be some good news. So hopefully that catches you up. And today we're in part 4, and we're talking about just simply 2 words, till death. I'm calling this till death. And here's where we need to go. We need to talk about if the Bible, in fact, is central to the Christian faith, but not the center, and if the center is actually occupied by the Trinitarian God whom Jesus reveals, then what do we do with that? Like, where do we get some insight to that sort of approach to Jesus? Well, this movement, again, of Jesus, with and for Jesus, is something that Luke chapter 1 wants to make sure to document. Just like we looked at Paul and John in earlier reflections, now let's look at this wonderful account we have in the Gospel of Luke about why these authors are writing these things down. And so Luke looks at the Jesus event and wants to invite us into the Jesus event. And here's how it is worded. This is the Common English Bible. Chapter 1, verse 1. Many people have already applied themselves to the task of compiling an original account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used what the original eyewitnesses, big deal, right? The original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed down to us. Now, after having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, I have also decided to write a carefully ordered account for you, most honorable Theophilus. I want you to have confidence in the soundness of the instruction you have received. So let's start with a couple of things here, right? That Luke makes the same point we've been making this whole time, that there were events fulfilled among his contemporaries which needed accounting for so that new followers of Jesus would understand the movement they had joined. He says there's original eyewitnesses. They handed the stories down, and these stories, again, are what we've called the Jesus event, especially when we think about the resurrection kickstarting this movement. And let's be clear. Luke isn't writing a solo project. Luke's gospel doesn't come down either on golden tablets. He is taking sources and documentation very seriously. He draws probably there's interaction between, of course, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We probably can assume that he has access to other accounts from witnesses and other stories about Jesus. But here's the big idea. Here's the big point. That Luke tells the Jesus event story so that those who come after him, and even this guy Theophilus, who perhaps was a patron, right? So a lot of times when people do ministry work, they need funding to make that ministry work happen. And so Theophilus is like, hey, let me help you. You've helped me so much. You've already told me the stories. I've already become part of this movement. Write it down so I know how to talk about it, right? And so they want to know, Luke wants to know, the writer of this gospel wants to know that those who come after him will be able to trust that the movement they have joined is rooted in reality. So it's not like this is an ordered account to create a new systematic theology, right? This isn't like an ordered, hey, doctrine of God, doctrine of Jesus, doctrine of salvation, right? This is an ordered historical account because something has happened that has warranted some sort of a historical ordering to these events. So it has to do with what it means to follow Jesus in this movement. And he's going to emphasize, I love this, Luke will emphasize the outcasts of society. He will talk about the disciples being these hands and feet of generosity, mercy and justice. I mean, as disciples of Jesus, and not just the early disciples, but every disciple that will come after. Luke sets this patron up. He's like, look, Theophilus, you've done well by worldly financial standards. Make sure you hold on to that loosely. Following Jesus means opening up your hands a bit. So I love this dynamic, right? The gospel document with a named patron is the gospel document that emphasizes the poor and generosity probably the most. Isn't that solid? Again, this is an account so that someone, Theophilus, and others like him will become part of the movement even more thoroughly. So I want to say that this is a compelling movement. This is not just something that is compelling that happened on Easter morning. The Jesus event was compelling. But what is compelling is the way in which Luke is talking about loving enemies, feeding hungry people, clothing the naked, offering piety through prayer, and really trying to give the readers a picture of why the Jesus event propels them into motion. It is this movement of love that is at the center of their communal life that Jesus has launched into the world because Jesus himself is the center of their communal devotion. And so that's what's going on. And it's a movement that becomes so compelling that the rich and the poor, citizens of the empire and slaves to the empire, all will eventually start to sit at the same table. And here's the deal. It is so compelling that they're willing to say, till death, I'm a follower. Till death, I'm in this movement. Till death, I'm with Jesus on this. Till death. Something happened that was so compelling that it divided the world for the next 300 years. And of course, there are, in fact, two reactions to the Jesus movement. I want to get into those in just a moment. Acknowledging that I'm simplifying a bit, I want to talk about two reactions to the Jesus event. So there's really just two. And maybe you remember earlier in this series, we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and we noticed that Paul gives his own kind of ordered account of Jesus' event, right? Like he tells us what he had been told from the beginning. And Paul states that he doesn't even deserve, and this is a quote, doesn't even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. That's in 1 Corinthians 15:9. And so he has this idea in his own narrative that he's joined the Jesus movement because of the Jesus event and his own experience of the Jesus event on the road to Damascus, according to Acts. And he realizes that he has been on both sides of the polar opposite reaction to the Jesus event and the Jesus movement itself. So reaction number one, of course, that we see in Paul even is this event that happened was so compelling that it was worth dying for. And then, of course, reaction number two is this so-called event that some say happened was so destructive that it must be stopped. And this continues to be the pattern for quite some time. Now, none of this led the earliest followers of Jesus to stop and say, wow, we should really get together and make sure we have our Bible all put together in a coherent way. Like, none of it did. Nope. It led them to suffering and death. It led them to follow Jesus when it was hard. They didn't first and foremost follow a book. They followed a person and the teachings that had been handed down as a result of the Jesus event. So to be clear again, no Jesus event, i.e. no resurrection, then no movement and eventual Bible. It is Jesus that was, from the beginning, the sole reason people gave their lives to keep the movement going. So what do we do with how all of these things come together? Like, how did we actually end up with a Bible in its final form? Well, I want to remind us of the flow of the events that we've been talking about, right? So we start, of course, with the Jesus event. I've made this clear. I'm going to say it one last time here. His life, teachings, death, resurrection. Again, the resurrection being the most important from the event perspective because it's what launches a sociological experiment called the Jesus movement that is more than an experiment, obviously. Then his appearances after the resurrection, the ascension, and somewhere down there eventually, hopefully, future return, right? So Jesus event, and then we have the Jesus movement. I'm kind of going chronologically here a little bit. The ongoing gathering of communities committed to worshiping the triune God and living in the power of God's Spirit to represent God's kingdom. Or, if you don't like the word kingdom, party, or several other images for what it looks like when God's values come to bear among us. And then the third sort of progression, of course, is the New Testament documents, or I've said it previously, I've just kind of kept it all together as Jesus documents, right? Jesus event, Jesus movement, now Jesus documents. And these are various documents that are recognized early on as being Holy Scripture, although not systematically organized throughout all the churches at this time, especially in the early couple hundred years, right? And then eventually we get to a compiled Bible. This is finally putting together and kind of organizing the Bible as we know it in the 4th century in continuity, by the way, with what the churches throughout the known world already affirmed about a particular set of 27 documents, along with the Hebrew scriptures that had become accepted as the norm. And so we keep that flow in mind. We're going back to the Apostle Paul, who gives us this example of two reactions to the Jesus movement. And for 300 years, these two reactions go wild. And I mean that in all its forms. It is wild in all kinds of beautiful ways and then all kinds of violent, evil ways. And here's a couple of things that maybe will help us understand it, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you either believe the Jesus event and give yourself to the Jesus movement, or you don't. And for a variety of reasons, death enters the picture. So here's some highlights. I'm air quoting that, by the way. Highlights of some of those 300 years that follow the resurrection. And so I'm going to start actually with 64 CE and talk about how Rome has this fire. And Nero decides, hey, those local Jesus followers, I'm pretty sure that they caused the fire, although everyone kind of knew it was him, according to sources. And so they get tortured. It's horrible. Of course, we know that the Jewish revolt in Judea, when Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans, this war, the Jewish wars are happening from 66 to 70, and then 70 happens, and Jerusalem is destroyed, and most Jesus followers, we think, and many Jews as well, again, they're all Jews, so I want to be very clear about that. Messianic Jews and non-Messianic Jews, many of them flee to Asia Minor at that time. Many of the followers of Jesus who do this, we think, hey, really took his words seriously. When you see all this stuff happening in Jerusalem during your generation, you better run for the hills and get out of Dodge because it's all coming down. Not one stone will be left unturned, according to Mark 13, etc. Then around 95, we know about some particular executions under Domitian, the Emperor Domitian, and some of them are against Christians, but it's not all towards them, and it's not systematic. It's, specific, I guess you would say. But there are some Christians who are killed there. There's some witness in Revelation chapter 2:13, Antipas of Pergamum. And so we don't know exactly when Antipas was martyred, but we know that this happens. In 112, there's some more Christians that are killed. Pliny the Younger is very instrumental in this. We continue going through this chronology, and we know somewhere in the early 100s, we're not exactly sure on the exact date, but Ignatius of Antioch is taken to Rome, also executed. Now, again, we remember that the apostles are being executed. We think Paul was executed sometime in the early to mid 60s, right? So I'm not throwing those dates in here, just showing you sort of the progression into the 2nd and 3rd century beyond. So we have all kinds of stuff happening, and we're barely at 132 because during 132 to 135, of course, there is a Bar Kokhba revolt, and that's not specifically Christian or Messianic in any sense, but it's an important Jewish revolt that happens and, is unsuccessful ultimately. And then somewhere around 150, the execution of a teacher named Ptolemaeus. and of Lucius in Rome. This is reported by Justin Martyr. Somewhere around 156, 157, Polycarp and 11 others are killed in Smyrna in 162-ish to 168. Justin and 6 others are executed, and the list goes on and on. We get some of this in Eusebius, who kind of tells us of various executions of Christian leaders and people during that time. Then in 177-ish, we have historical evidence for about 50 Christians in Gaul being executed. 180, 12 more Christians in Sicily. In 180 to 185-ish, the beheading in Rome of Christian philosopher Apollonius. I totally said that weird, but you can look it up. And then in 202 to 206, right? And so I'm just like, man, guys, I'm just like barely giving you some highlights, and there's still so much to say. I have a few more bullet points here, and then I'm going to stop because this is like, dude, you're just overwhelming us with all these sad things that happened a long time ago. Yeah, I know. I get it. So we're going to keep going, though. So 202 to 206, there were arrests and deaths of Christians in Carthage. We know Perpetua, Felicitas, and others somewhere in 203. We know this is happening in Rome, also in Corinth, Alexandria. The father of Origen is killed during this time, and several others. It's documented. And then we get to this place where historical records show that by about 206 to 235, so a decent gap, there's very few incidents against Christians. So these are positive times. And yet, somewhere around 236, there's at least political oppression under Maximus I. And so now we see some pressure towards them again. It builds up from 238 to 249. After that kind of buildup of oppression, all of a sudden, it's like, hey, the next 2 emperors are nicer. And there's kind of a decade or so of relative peace. So that's where I'm going to start, and we're at 249, friends. We haven't even made it to 250 CE or AD, and we have a long list already. But here's the big idea so far. Christianity spread, even under persecution, without a compiled Bible. Something that had happened was so compelling that over and over and over and over again, Christ's followers were willing to suffer and even die rather than forsake the Jesus they had come to know and follow. So the Bible is indeed wonderful. It is absolutely beautiful. It is one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given to humanity. But in this kind of environment, it isn't the primary motivation for this sort of faith commitment. That's what we need to own. It is not the primary motivation. Now, the events that it gives witness to, now there is the gold. And inside those events is Jesus himself, the incarnation of the Trinitarian God. And there we have the motivation for why people are willing to lay it all down, not just for a movement per se, but for the Jesus of the movement. For these early and many modern Christians throughout the world today, when they joined the Jesus movement, they were saying, till death. And friends, that's where we're going to stop today, because there is so much more of the story to pick up in the next reflection, the next part of this series, where we are going to continue and we will look at where in the world does the Bible actually come from, and when does this take place? When it is Old and New Testament, and how does that shape where we go from there as Bible readers in the 21st century? Hey friends, this was fun. I hope you're enjoying this series. I hope you'll share it with other people. subscribe, if you don't mind, to the email list over at my Substack blog, which is really my newsletter sending agent, so to speak. Go over there, subscribe, and hopefully you'll get the latest updates from both the podcast version and the written version that you can check out. Hope you're having a great day. Enjoy the commute, enjoy the jog, enjoy wherever you find yourself, and may the Jesus event continue to propel you into your day as his representative of beauty, love, grace, and hope in a world that needs it more than ever.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.